So we will start this part of the conference. Now we are having a round table with several guest speakers from different perspectives. We have in this table Paul Lyle, you already know from the intervention from today morning. Mike, Ramiro is a co-author with me. We wrote a book about business models, and tomorrow we will present it in this conference. We already presented in Brazil. And here is Javier. Javier is teaching in Instituto del Empresa in Spain, and Greg from Tampere University from Finland, but is American. So we have a good speakers, good experts to share with us some topics about business models, about market challenge, and other big topics regarding the media news and media policy. So maybe we can start with a general question to open this discussion. To Greg. Greg, what do you think is a big challenge in terms of business model to television and to newspaper news? What do you think that is?
Well, there's a couple of important challenges that seem to be crucial. One has to do with making a transition from an era in which the essential concept of media has been all about transmission. That's the unique and important thing about mass media, whether it's a newspaper, radio, television. It's about transmission. It's about people who have content. That content is a scarce resource. It is then transmitted to a large population of people who lack that resource and who have historically, therefore, been a good source of revenue generation. What we deal with in this current era, though, is an environment in which transmission is not sufficient. I don't say that transmission goes away. I think a lot of the hype over new media and the development of a lot of these interactive platforms is a bit exaggerated. I think the technology changes faster than people's behavior changes. But I do think that the major challenge that big media firms face is learning how to be not in the transmission business, but in the communication business. And that involves something quite different. Of course, we say this is mass communication, but the fact of the matter is it's not been a dialogue, has it? It's been more a one-way medium, a one-to-many form of transmission. And these companies, in the way they think, their orientation towards the business that they're in, their understanding of who and what an audience is, their understanding of what content is and how it works, all of those things are up for interrogation in this environment where there's a greater need for dialogue and communication, and in a sense, dependency. This is the thing that these companies have not had in the past. They had the power. Now that they're vulnerable. They're a lot more vulnerable than they've ever been before, and that is a very uncomfortable position to be in. That's one challenge. How do we make that transition from being transmission industries to communication industries? A second major issue, and I think it underlies all this discussion about future business models, is where are we going to find, who is going to be able to find the forms of symbiosis that make new media really profitable. And I'll give an example of what I mean by symbiosis. Once upon a time, radio was the major electronic medium. And then along comes television. And what television really was in the early years was nothing more or less than radio with pictures. It took all the programs that had been on the radio and put them on TV. The stars that had been on radio became performers on TV. The programs became programs on TV. And radio went into a kind of eclipse. It didn't have enough revenue. It was in crisis. But over time, what happens is the radio industry and the recording industry find a natural symbiosis. The recording industry needs a way to promote music for sales and for popularity of artists, and radio needs content. And these two industries were able to create a symbiotic relationship that has worked really quite well for, nearly 50 years now. There are problems in this day and age, but anyway, the overall example is good. Now, where are these kind of symbiotics or symbiotic relationships between newspapers and the internet, or the internet and television? How is this all going to work? I mean, is it really a kind of thesis like the fallacy of lump sum labor? Where there's only so much labor, and if somebody comes and takes the job, somebody else doesn't have a job, or is it actually much more dynamic than that? Where are these forms of symbiosis? Because wherever they are, wherever you can find mutual benefit, mutual profitability, that's the future. But it's very unclear where that is right now.
Okay, thank you. So, Javier, what do you think about the impact of social network in terms of media business models? What do you think that the people will migrate more the attention to social media, and they will reduce the attention to media, television, and other kind of media entertainment and media products?
Yeah, that's a great question. Social media has been and is now like a huge opportunity. Yesterday we were looking at the people who are following one of the televisions in Spain, and it was almost half a million people are following one TV. So it's like now the people are watching TV, but they follow the TV through the social media. So I see that social media has a huge potential, and it's a reality now to be part of the television and the communication industry. And also I was asking one of the persons here about how did he know about this class, this program. And he told me that he saw something in a social network about this, so he came because of that. He told me this morning, and it's like, so interesting the power of social media, not only in the communication industry, but also in bringing people together in reality. So I see it's a huge potential and an opportunity for everybody. That's the great news, that everybody here, you are sitting there, you have this ability because you can sign up into the social networking sites actually for free. So you can actually take advantage of that.
Do you think the social media will compete more in terms of advertising with industry?
Yeah.
Because we observe the trend to improve the social media as an advertising support.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's happening that every day is more interested in investing advertising in the internet. So more people, more companies are putting money into advertising in Google, in Facebook, in all of these places, rather than putting the advertisement in traditional media. So it definitely is moving towards that, and it's decreasing the other one, because actually it's cheaper to advertising in internet than in an advertisement on TV. So yeah.
Thank you. So Ramiro, today we discussed some topics about business models, about international trends, namely European and United States. Always in Brazil, the discussion the practice about the business model from again. They are trying to explore another source of revenue.
Yes, I would like to bring a different point of view. The point of view of the advertiser, o anunciante. The big player on design the future of media belongs to the decision we are going to take. In Brazil, we are having a very important movement from the budget, from TV to the point of sale. In the past, the trade marketing area in the company used to be small, not important part of the marketing area in big companies like Unilever, Nestlé, and others, and so on. And now these areas are bigger than the advertising areas inside these companies. And this is causing a new focus on specifically transactions on point of sale. So I would like to show an example. It's in a video. It's a quick video. I would like to show this example that I would like to share to you. With you. Let's see. Okay. This is an experience made by Tesco in Korea. Let me show.
So, adjusting to the local market, it even changed the name itself from Tesco to Home Plus. And at last, it grew to rank number 2 in Korea. But Tesco had to overcome one obstacle, a fewer number of stores compared to the number 1 company, E-Mart. Mission: could we become number 1 without increasing the number of stores? We made an in-depth study into Koreans once more. Koreans are the second most hardworking people in the world. For them, grocery shopping once a week is a dreaded task. So we decided to approach these busy and tired people. Idea: let the store come to the people. We created virtual stores, hoping to blend into people's everyday lives. Our first try was subway stations. Although virtual, the displays were exactly the same as actual stores, from the display to the merchandise. Only one thing was different. We used smartphones to shop. Scan the QR code with your phone, and the product automatically lands in your online cart. When the online purchase is done, it will be delivered to your door right after you get home. People can relax more after work and on weekends.
실제로 보면서 사니까 진짜 좋은 것 같아요. 편하더라고요.
Result: people can shop at Tesco Home Plus wherever they go, without having to visit the actual store. Moreover, we could change their waiting time to shopping time. After this campaign, online sales increased tremendously. Through this campaign, 10,287 consumers visited the online Home Plus mall using smartphones. The number of new registered members rose by 76%, and online sales increased 130%. Currently, Home Plus has become number 1 in the online market, and is a very close second offline.
The point here, Dr. Faustino, is that they are changing the entire effort in budget and in thinking of the way of communication to the end consumer. So we are having a lot of experience, and specifically on the media, we have an experience I would like to share with you. Let me, how can I can go back to this X. Okay, let me go back here. This is, oh no, it's not.
Yeah, you have the rest.
My Mac. Where is my Mac? So, oops. Let's go. No. Let me show you. Just one moment. My magazine is a proposal that everyone can choose the content of a magazine in Brazil. And you choose if you're going to pay or not. As Professor Fred said, you can decide if you're going to pay or not. If you're not going to pay, you are going to accept some advertisements. So we are going to have this free of charge. This is the example.
Já imaginou fazer?
I'm going to translate for this one.
Já imaginou fazer sua própria revista? Com a MyMac você pode. Veja como é fácil e rápido e até grátis montar sua própria edição, navegando pelas 14 seções ou pelos destaques do site. Ainda não achou o que estava procurando? O sistema...
We have 10 different contents and for many different, like you have Vision here, and you have Diário Econômico. You choose some sections for this content and create your own magazine, okay? So you can choose this.
Uma de busca vai te ajudar. Gostou de alguma matéria? É só arrastar para o campo Minha Revista. Ah, você pode arrastar até 7 reportagens para completar sua edição. Simples, não? Agora é a hora de escolher qual capa você quer. Arraste para baixo.
After that, you can choose your front page. I would like this front page, okay? And you can decide if you're going to have printed or online.
Achou que ia pagar por ela? Só se você quiser. Optando pela versão digital patrocinada, seu bolso não sente nada e a MyMag sai grátis para você. Você ainda pode ter uma capa exclusiva, com seu nome, se optar por receber impressa na sua casa. No leitor digital você também vê vídeos, comenta e presta as matérias para qualquer amigo. Cadastre-se já e seja bem-vindo à MyMag, a revolução das revistas.
So, my final mark was, we are having an experience time. It's time to experience. And this is why I like my presentation. We have no answers, but we need to try different approaches.
This is a very interesting project. So, do you know if they are doing money?
This is a beta system. They have launched this in the ANER conference 3 months ago. I don't know if there's any results about this.
I'm asking because there
Yes.
are great ideas today, but the problem is to make money.
I agree.
With the developments.
Yes, that right.
Well, how do you perceive the movement in Portugal for media companies in this context of transformation? Although you have international growth experts, do you think we are doing the big effort to diversify the profit, the media companies? They are trying to apply the best practice that we observe in other markets, and we have some limitation because our market is very small. So, what do you think? And another question: all they can, all Portuguese media companies can develop the market, and what market they can explore in terms of internationalization process?
Okay, beginning right here. Naturally, our natural market is the market of Lusophonia. In this very moment, in this city, there are around 50 of the biggest Portuguese company CEOs that are discussing how to use Portuguese people living abroad to help the country to have a larger number of exportations and to try to develop Portuguese products to be more well known. And the President of the Republic is there, because this is organized by an organization called COTEC, which is chaired at the same time by the Portuguese President of the Republic, the King of Spain, and the President of the Republic of Italy. And what is curious is that before coming, after lunch, I wrote a letter to the organizer saying, hey guys, what about the 3 million of newspapers that we are sending during all the year to Portuguese people that live abroad? 3 million. Have you ever used this newspaper? In paper. Right? Newspaper in paper. Distributed in paper. Some of them have naturally there are digital editions, but I'm speaking of the old-fashioned system and saying these 3 million of newspapers have an average of 24 pages each one. So, how many million of pages you have per year to explain to these Portuguese people that they can do something actual, something for the future of their native-born country? And what are you explaining them? All the quiz of small times, all the small things that most of them can remember no more because they tell stories of content that has been moved from here to there, and most of them can't remember more. And each time, each year that goes on, for the business of these editors that are still sending these newspapers through all over the world, there is no reason why we can keep there with us, because they are giving them nothing new, nothing different, nothing that really endorses them, their ability to be part of an effort that Portugal has to do nowadays. So, this is the first time that I'm writing to someone that is organizing one thing like this, asking them, but why are you not considering discussing the role, the task of these publishers to help what you are concerned to, that is to show that there is Portuguese abroad, Portuguese that are CEOs around the world that have real power to make decisions of whether they can help their native country to develop more its economy. So this is where I think this is the natural market that we have. It's the Portuguese language, contrary to Spain, for instance, where a Portuguese academic has developed in the last 3 years a study of the economic value of the Spanish language. We have a small idea about the economic value of the Portuguese language, but last week I was here in a breakfast with the CEO of our company that distributes gasoline and all the oil and so on. And they have a large exploitation in Mozambique of natural gas offshore. It's so big that it could be enough for the Portuguese needs during their 10 years. And the part of this Portuguese company is only 10% of the capacity of the whole field. So it's something, in fact, enormous. One thing that they are going to do is that they have to build there a new city, because it's in the very northern part of Mozambique, and you can't imagine Mozambique is as big as from Lisbon to Paris. From south to north, it's as big as from Lisbon to Paris. So it's a very long country. And I would think that next days, in the newspapers, there should be a lot of information about this, saying, hey, look, this is something we have to do, this is something we have to be sure that in this new city, people are going to speak Portuguese and not English. Because otherwise they will speak English, because most of the technicians on these matters, they will be speaking English between themselves. So you have to offer them whatever you can in and under the Portuguese culture. So my view is that, in fact, for the Portuguese media, and it's not only newspapers and magazines, but also radio and television, Portuguese-speaking people around the world, and the Portuguese culture is very important. Lord Sorensen, which is the WPP chairman, was here for a lecture 1.5 years ago. And he said, I'm sorry, I don't have good news for you. Why you are in Europe? Portuguese people in Europe has no value for me, for my company, which is the biggest communication company in the world. But Portuguese people is one of the ways to communicate with the BRICS or with the next 11s that you have the highest value you can imagine. In Brazil, in Russia, in India, in China. And in the next 11s, we will only have Argentina somehow, South Africa and Angola if they reach. But the opportunity is now there. It's for the development of the BRICS. So, for instance, when the FIFA Championship was held in South Africa, we led a mission to Mozambique and we made a conference in Mozambique. What for? In the last European and World FIFA and UEFA Championship, there was at last moment always a discussion between media representatives and the organizations on how they could operate inside the stadiums. It happens since the last 5 or 6 organizations like it. Why? Because the organizers are preparing everything without listening to the needs, but and more than the needs, the developments that we are using now on everything, networks and so on that we use. So, when people began to ask for their accreditations, they are asking journalists to sign terms of responsibility as I, on behalf of my company, declare that I will not use the photo for this purpose or for that purpose, or I will only wire 10 minutes after the game is finished and so on. So a lot of principles that were not fitting with the organization of the newsrooms that was prepared when they were sent there. So what we did in Mozambique, we said, if we discuss these 2 years in advance, maybe we will reach a platform. Because when you discuss this in the last 6 months, the people that are in the organization, they don't want to hear anything of changing what they have been preparing during 6 years, 7 years, 8 years at last moment. And even if they understand, many times they will have not the money, they will have not the skills, and they don't know how to explain to their superiors, I have to change it again. So the best thing is to say, who are these guys that are bothering us and that they want to change everything? So we were able to make in a third country, and a neutral country, because of the Portuguese language, we were able to sit at the same table, negotiators from our side, World Association of Newspapers, European Newspapers Association, and News Media Coalition, which is a kind of a lobby association that is based in London. And that is now the biggest expertise on the negotiation on baseball, on rugby, and on cricket. Believe me, whenever it happens in baseball, then it will happen in cricket, and then it will happen in rugby. And once they have tried these different sports on the way they are transmitted, then it comes to all sports, from motor cars to football to wherever. So we have settled this News Media Coalition to counter them and to discuss with them. And we did it 2 years in advance, and there were no problems in South Africa. So now we are saying the same thing to our Brazilian friends. ANER and ABER, we are telling them, please, next year we have to organize there something. And Brazil is a very important moment because you have the Olympics and you have the World FIFA Championship. And if you look to what the British are proposing in rights and in the organization of how to make the coverage for the Olympics in London, you will see that you have the last capacities of the analogical world, and everything is becoming digital. Everything is becoming, what I like to say, data media. So, in Brazil, everything will be data media. You will have no more analogical way of looking for the coverage of the sports. So, we had, to answer your question, 2 very big opportunities for the Portuguese language. And in sports, if you achieve something, you will be able to explain it to the rest of the world because you have achieved business. First, you have achieved business. Secondly, you have achieved business that people understand and that people are involved. It's not that thing of politics or that thing of economics that I have to accept, I have to know, I am obliged to have some attention, to pay some attention. There is no sports. I want to be, I want to feel, I want to participate. And this helps us very much in the business side to understand how far our consumers of our products are ready to go to participate in our offers. And this is, on my view, a unique opportunity for the Portuguese beauty business to show once more that we are able to take something out of it.
Mike, German has a very strong industry, book industry. They are present in several markets, so it's a very good internationalized sector. But media business is not. So, what are the next challenge for German media companies to internationalize the markets? For example, Balkan regions will be opportunity to German media sector develop its business.
I think the first step is they have to change their management thing, because Germans need or love to have long-term strategies, and the time has changed. We have a new market or a very dynamic market, and so you need another thinking and all this. What you said about the markets in East Europe and so on. I think that's the first step. The second step is the German leaders have to learn to think in digital products. It's a new form of product. It's another product. And I think the typical publishers like Gruner & Jahr and Bertelsmann, they are very international. Because Bertelsmann, for example, earns 70% of income is international. Only 30% is German. And Gruner & Jahr is 65 or 68%. So they are very international. I think if you just look to the publishers, there's no problem. If you just talk about broadcasting and film and music industry, there is a problem because they have to think international and they have to think about new strategies for new digital markets because they think very original, very German-like. And what is to do? Yes, first, Greg, it was very interesting what you said about radio. I think the future is a community radio. If you just have a talk to German private radios, they say digital radio is not interesting for us. We just think in community radio, web radio. That's the future for us. So they decide to think about strategies in this way. But now we have the question, I repeat, how can we earn money in this way? Because if we just want to offer some advertising, we just can't measure that. There's no option to measure. And nobody wants to pay for this kind of community radio. Because communities are free. And who wants to buy for it? That's the question also for fair. Who's willing to pay for radio? I like all these radio stations from the United States or from the UK, but I don't have to pay for them. Yeah.
Actually, you do. Well,
By the way, do you can also discuss?
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, you can.
But I think it's very interesting.
in a way you do. I was thinking earlier. And I'll talk about it a little more in my own presentation, but do you know how much your annual media cost is for your individual consumption and for your household? Who here knows? Right now, tell me, how much it cost you in 2010 for the media system that you have? How much? How much did you pay?
This telecommunication all without it.
All of it.
All of it.
Media world that you're in, how much did it cost you individually, and how much did it cost your household? Everything.
$200.
Oh, ridiculously low. I went through my own history, okay? And this is ballpark figures. Okay, I have a smartphone. I have to pay for that. I have the network that's required. That's a monthly bill. Depends on how much I use the phone. I have a set amount of money, but if I go beyond that use, then I have to pay extra. Ends up, if you take the whole thing together, it's about $600 a year. I have an iPod. I download some music. I figured out how much of that it cost me. It's about $300 a year. I subscribe to The Economist magazine, $122 for the year. Newspaper, $95 for the year. Canal Digital, $400 for the year. Broadband connection, $300 for the year. I buy DVDs on occasion, generally about 4 or 5 series a year, €250. I have a couple games a year that I use for my PlayStation 3, easily $180 a year. License fee for YLE, $250. I buy a lot of books because I like to read and I'm an academic, about $500 a year. That's €3,300 a year right now. Now, I live in Finland where taxes are high, very high. That's right about 1 month of my take-home salary. Now that's not yet including things like, what do I have to pay when I have to update my television set, when I have to get a new radio, when I have to get a new computer. And that's not including the fact that every single product that I buy, some portion of that product is the advertising it took to sell it to me. Right? I mean, companies don't eat that. When I buy a carton of milk, some percentage of that price of the milk was the cost for advertising the company and its products. I guarantee it, if I put the whole thing together, at minimum, 2 months of my take-home salary a year goes into media costs. Now, how much more do you expect me to pay? Huh? I'm done. I've given my contribution.
Greg, it's interesting because we just talked about new revenue models. In Germany, for example, if you ask households what do they pay for their local newspaper, 70% of the households don't know what they pay for their local newspaper because it's like milk and water and whatever. It's something you use and you have. Yeah? Nobody knows what are they paying for it because it's there.
Yeah.
And I think this is very important, what you said, that is changing. Because more and more, you just talk about prices. I repeat from my presentation. You talk about the prices. Yeah? If you just talk about telecommunication access, internet access, and so on. Because a lot of this is free. And now, a lot of people, if you just do some survey in households, they say, oh, I can just take this newspaper, this local newspaper for free on the internet. I don't need this paper for the future. So now the local newspaper has to decide, what are we doing now? Like similar, that is a Boulevard Bild, our biggest newspaper in Germany. This is one-to-one in internet and mobile devices. It doesn't cost anything. And interesting is, they sell 3.3 million a day papers. You can use it in internet for free. And interesting is, they sell 3.3 million papers a day without subscription and so on. And it's interesting, huh? And there is the reason why the publishers in Germany are so relaxed. If you just talk to publishers, the local publishers in Germany, last week I talked to somebody who said, oh, Mr. Friedrichsen, we have no problem. Let's talk about the next 10 years, there's no problem, because we have some revenues in 28%. So there's no pressure to change anything now. Just talk about the future, and we think another one. But now there's no pressure for publishers in Germany to change. But if you think 5 or 10 years in the future, the pressure will increase each year, each month, each day. But now there's not enough pressure. And that's the reason why there is, I think, Ramiro, what you Your example is very interesting. What does it mean? It's nice to have. I have a smartphone, and then I can just try, if I come home at the metro station or so, I can buy something and I will bring it to my home. So it's nice. It's a very interesting add value. On the other side, there are some shops. They must show a reaction. So they also will try to find new add values that the people come to their shops. So there's a new competition. It's very, really interesting. On the other hand, maybe it's so interesting that all the people will buy this in this form you show in the future. Maybe. Nobody knows exactly. But interesting on Euro, that's interesting in the second example. And that's for German, the new way. Trial and error. Trial and error. That's a new form of strategies. Trial and error. There is no other option if you just want to find out what is the value of new digital products. You have to find this ways in this form that you trial and error. It's the only way. And that's a new form of strategy. And that's for German companies. Extreme, right? Because we think in other ways. Of course.
Well, then there are always two things that strikes me very much when we have this kind of discussions. Is that no one speaks about regulation.
Yes.
And with regulation will be the way that governments, local authorities, whoever will have the problem, will try to decide the way that from the 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 euros that we pay each year, they will try to get some more money from that sum. They will fix it out. They know how to do it. In order that the financing of the media system will come from that money. If we publishers will not find, and I know that in Germany this is something almost untouchable. Anytime I say in Portugal we have some state aid, all my German friends, they look at me and they say, go to Morocco or go to Nigeria or even better to the bottom of the sea, because you are a dangerous person with dangerous ideas and very dangerous ways of doing things. So, but the fact is that we have to look each time more. For instance, now I'm negotiating in the name of the Portuguese broadcasters the possibility that a part, a share of all those millions that I explained this morning that will come from selling the digital dividend in Portugal will be given by the government to them, to the government to maintain and to sustain their businesses. So, in fact, we have here a real question, which is if I will have everything for free, or if I already pay a lot of money for accesses and so on, who is going to keep rolling the news machine?
João, you have brought a very good question. Yeah, I agree entirely. And the new Brazilian law on pay TV has, how can I say, some aspect that can answer your question. In the past, you have three players: the producer, the programmer, and the distribution. Okay, they create a creator. The people there said, okay, you're going to have everything you want by your system and pay 3,000 euros a year, but you have to have in your package education channel. So, but I don't like, okay, this is a decision, because if you choose what you want, you are going to have junk food, only McDonald's commodity communication. So they have some curator, that's the name. In Brazil it's another name, but the concept is exactly that. Okay, we are going to have this competition, we are going to have media trying to get free content to the recipients, but we are not allowing people to do everything they want. We are going to have some content that needs to have a curator to decide. Even if you want just to eat McDonald's, we are going to have some salad in your package. So you have to have the balance. So I think it's a very good way to approach this question.
Look here, I'm negotiating now new Portuguese law for the cinema and the audiovisual. There is no industry of cinema and audiovisual in Portugal. There is not. It's the beginning. So, how do they finance it? Each broadcaster, each distributor of programs in cable and so on, each telecom has to pay a share for the production of Portuguese films and Portuguese audiovisuals. But look, a film in Portugal costs between 300,000 euros to 600,000 euros to pay. And the average that a television broadcaster has to pay annually for this production is something like 5 million. And you know what people from television say to me? How can I explain, my bosses, that you are asking me to pay 600 million euros to produce one film that will take me 1.5 hours of all proclamation of the whole year? It's impossible. It's totally impossible. I cannot do that. Even if I had the money, I cannot explain that 1.5 hours of the proclamation of television could cost 600 million when all the money I have for my annual budget on buying features, serials and so on is something like 30 million or 40 million euros. How is it possible? How can you do this? But if you don't do this, then you will have a total collapse on the so-called Portuguese industry of cinema and audiovisual. So, in fact, and I think you put it very well, we have to think first and also that we have the money, maybe you have to use it in another way.
But there are two aspects of regulation. First is what you said, regulation of markets.
Yeah.
And the second is, if you just have a look to the democratic system, that's a discussion we just started in Germany, to talk about what does it mean when the classical media is in decreasing influence. There is a new influence of social media, of new media. What does it mean for the system? And maybe that's a topic for a new conference because it's too much to discuss it now. But it's interesting if you just talk about regulation. It's regulation on this topic, democratic system. The second is, of course, you're right. If you just talk about media markets, yes, we need some regulation. We just talk about public broadcasting. It's a presentation from Greg. And we need the regulation of the film industry in Germany too. It's very important for the film industry in Germany. Without regulation, there would be no film industry in Germany at all. Without regulation, nobody would try to produce a film in Germany because there's no money, there's no venture capital, nothing. 80% of the films in Germany are produced by supporting from the government. 80%. 80%. Wow. That's a lot.
Well, you have a very interesting dynamic. A lot of this discussion hinges on the degree to which one wants to privilege the rights, the prerogatives, and the potentiality of the individual versus the collective. Now, the era of mass media where there were very few channels, whether it was television, radio, or newspaper, the great advantage you had there was that there was a very high possibility that a large percentage of the population would all be focused on one thing at one time. You could have higher degrees of cohesion, and you could also have, unfortunately, higher degrees of coercion. In this current age we live in, where people are making more decisions, and there are many more sources available, and they're making those decisions individually, in a sense, the individual has kind of overcome, maybe even overwhelmed, the mass channels. The mass channels are in a quite confused state as what to do. But the paradox is, when you start looking at this instead of at the individuals inside the individual state, and you start thinking about this internationally, there, the mass has kind of overwhelmed the individual country. If you think about production, I have an example from Denmark. The cost to produce 1 hour of television at DR Denmark of a particular quality that would be of the same as, say, for example, the example I would give was Beverly Hills 90120. The cost to do that for 1 hour in Denmark is 400,000 euros. The cost to buy Beverly Hills 91201 is only 40,000 euros. 10% of the cost. And many of the young people in Denmark will watch happily the import. All right? So the mass of the international market begins to overwhelm the individual country because it's so much cheaper, it's so much better revenue model to import a lot of content than it is to actually produce it at home, right? This is part of the thing that we're getting into that is a really, it has to do with regulation. And it has to do with the fact that media goods are not like refrigerators. Television programs are not like refrigerators and toasters. They are public goods. They have effects on the way people think about the world, on the way they interact with each other. The things that make media products valuable are not only about money. But of course you could never ignore the money dimension. So it raises huge, questions and a lot of really thorny dilemmas when regulators begin to think about how they could finance things at home. And then you end up running into EU regulation from the European Commission about state aid and so forth that puts a slammer on that. And you're not allowed to, or you have to deregulate your market in order to match some supranational, international system that ends up being dominated by the big players. And small countries get caught in the middle of it. And that's partly what this book that I talk about next is about. Is it really true that big countries and big companies are good, fair, adequate models for small countries, small markets? Is that true? And I basically conclude, along with a lot of other people contributing, that it's not.
Right. Does it mean that such normative management is increasing? Means corporate social responsibility, especially if we just talk about media companies, because if there are such more bigger companies who are acting worldwide, so there is more and more responsibility for. If you are right, if you say there is effect on all what media products do with us, with the reception, then we have to talk about responsibility of media companies at all. See Google or whatever, Facebook.
Well, we absolutely do. But, I mean, a lot of companies, the trend since 1982, basically, around 1980, 82, particularly in the United States beginning with Ronald Reagan, in Great Britain beginning with Thatcher, this all started in the early 80s, was to completely distance the idea that media have kind of larger social responsibilities. And the reason why that idea has now come back and become popular is because of the economic collapse in large part, and a lot of corporate misdeeds that a lot of people are saying, hey, look, we as individuals are paying the price for things that was not really our fault. And there should have been something a lot more responsible going on in these companies. But I don't know how serious these companies really are about that. I'm not really sure. I mean, I hear a lot of good talk about this, but operationalizing it, I don't know. I don't see a lot of really great evidence of it yet. Bits and pieces maybe, but I don't know. I'm not sure it's not PR more than anything else.
You know what T-Mobile is doing now these days in Poland. Mobile German.
Sorry.
No. Just, they are trying to do in Poland something that they were not allowed to do in Germany. So, T-Mobile began asking the people using its network in Poland if they liked to have advertisement in the contents that they were receiving. And as under this net neutrality principle that we have discussed this morning, they cannot say if you have advertisement, you have to pay less, or you have to pay more, or I will ask for more payment from those who want to put contents. What are they doing? They are supplying their subscribers with a way to write to Polish authorities saying, I do not allow advertisement to come to my mobile. The same way we put in the mailboxes. And so they are going the other way around, saying to the advertisers, now I have here a set of people that do not want advertisement. If you want to put their product placement, sponsoring, or any other kind of aids to the production, you have to pay a lot of money. And these people are acting in their own capacities of, they think, protecting themselves. So this is going on during this day. It began the 1st of November, this action, because they think that if they can have something like 500,000 of subscribers saying, I do not want advertisement on the contents that I receive in my mobile, then they will be able to have a petition to the Polish Parliament in the sense that they will change the law and they will be allowed to have a different net neutrality in Poland.
So, now I will do a question for all table members. So, yesterday you mentioned the power of Google in terms of advertising market. So, Google is growing in terms of advertising business model, but media, they are losing money from advertising. So, and the other part, Google is digital, they are digitalizing books. What impact do you, for all table members, do you think the Google strategy for books and media products? Do you think they will be danger in terms? They will be affect the business model of the media business? They will be a new player. They are a new player, but they will reinforce the position in terms media as a media production.
You know, Europeana, which is the network of European public libraries, is trying to do the same thing that Google is doing without saying it. It means Europeana discovered that the way Google was treating the digitization of books was maybe a good model. And the impact of that was, for instance, the discussion of the directive of orphan works and works out of commerce that had no importance in Europe, transformed in 6 months one of the most important discussions in the cultural field in Europe is how to treat orphan works and out of commerce works. And who is interested in orphan works under the commercialization point of view? And when I say orphan works, I mean not only books, but also audiovisual orphan works. So, who is interested? Public libraries. Because you know that under the European system of legal deposit, you are obliged to deposit in libraries for 10 years now, more than 10 years now, also audiovisual works. So,
yes, but they are creating audience. This strategy is to reinforce the audience.
no, this strategy is because public libraries don't have budget, don't have money, and they need to create new sources of financing. exactly what you are saying. New sources of trying to sell something that in the past public libraries only lended or only gave the possibility to see. It's very, my view is that it's very important that public libraries are bringing the same business model of Google to books to begin with, and to begin with to offer works and out of commerce works, which was at the very beginning what Google did when they have agreements with libraries from universities and so on. It was just the beginning. So it's now Penguin and Reader Elsevier, which are the most that are fighting in Europe against these trends of the European system based on Google. So what we see is that as much as we don't like Google or we dislike Google, is that they are having business models that have something makes sense, their business models. The problem is that most of the people that uses them are still using them in an analogical world and not yet in a digital world. So, but this is...
I think it's no problem because I think positive. We don't need to fear if you think about Google and so on. Just take this chance. Google is very interesting, better versions of some new ideas, such like an innovation. It's very interesting. And so, an example. I just discussed with my publisher in Germany, who's publishing my books. And I said, let's do an application for books for the students. Interactive as an application, as Apple application. And it was horrible to discuss with them about this idea. I think it's a good idea because there is my consumer. The students want to have a new form of books in the future. They have another options of reading books and so on. So my reaction is we have to look to this market and what can we do to be interesting for our students, that the students will buy my books, my application. So I have to build this application not in an old-fashioned form like a book with 250 or 280 sites as a PDF. No, a new form of book, integrating of all these presentations and new forms of added values and so on. My publisher said no, there is no reason to do that. So then I say, and that's my argue, then we need just Google and others with innovative pressure for all these publishers and so on, that they just think about this new form, that there is a little bit pressure to do this, to think about what is changing in the area of researchers and consumers. That's the reason. It's exactly if you just think about the public broadcasting and so on, about radio. There is a new form of listening radio, of course. Not if you just drive with your car, then you just hear radio in old-fashioned form, because it's really a normal for you to do that. Yeah.
Mike, Google has a phrase that is a mission, don't evil. We don't believe in this. Why? When we made a research among our students to try to find out information about Google, using Google platform and other platforms, they block their own information. So there is a big contradiction in what they have done with the others and what they expect with them. They block their library names, they block the content of the algorithms, so you don't know it clearly how they rank the search. They don't want you to know, and they change every month the way, so you cannot understand how they work. So we have this research as a paper to send to government to say Google is not as angel as they said they are.
Okay, that's fine. No, they are not angels. What to say?
But in this line also in the game, there is a very interesting experience with Instituto Cervantes in Spain. with some of the major publishers from El País, El Mundo in Spain, which have a very, very good model of development of contents that would be more friendly consumer and more friendly payable. And the project has now 4 years, I think, or 5 years, or something like that. And that's something we should look upon, because it's aimed to South America mostly, and it's a very, very interesting project.
Well, one thing you have to deal with is that you talk about motion pictures, books, recordings. 90% are failures. 90% don't make money. It's called the hit model. And movie companies make 10 motion pictures because they know that one hit will make enough money to cover the cost of the other 9, plus deliver a hefty profit margin. And we talk about books. Think about how many books are published every year. How many of them succeed? And when they don't succeed, what happens to them? They don't get reprinted. They disappear into the black hole of history. So I don't have anything against Google digitizing books if we're talking about the wealth of things that have kind of in a way disappeared. And I don't think Google's trying to necessarily digitize the latest hit from Stephen King. So I'm not sure about this. I think there's a little more complexity to this issue. The other thing that is important for libraries, and you're absolutely right, it has a lot to do with the cost, but it's also the enormous cost of maintaining the facility of a library. All those books weigh a ton. It's not just any normal building that works well. And there's climate control issues that have to be dealt with. There's a lot of things that go into books that make this an extremely complicated thing if it's a physical product. But if it's a digital product, a lot of that goes away. And there is one additional added value that I personally find incredibly important: cut and paste. It's great to find great stuff online and be able to block this out and say in my article or whatever, according to Alboron, and here's the quote. I like that. So for me, it works.
But you have a lot of mentality. Portuguese book publishers, they don't want even to listen to the possibility of materializing their obligation of the legal deposit to be done in a digitization system. For the magazines and newspapers publishers, we have negotiated with government that under a good practice and a personal decision, we could substitute the legal deposit in paper for the legal deposit in digitization basis. But books, our colleagues from books, they even don't want to listen to this discussion. They say no and no and no for the reasons that you said.
Right.
They don't understand how it could empower a book.
Right, exactly.
There are three aspects, I think. And one is, of course, the competence of using this digital product. It's a problem for us in the academic. If I just talk to my students about Wikipedia or copy and paste and so on, that's really a big problem for us. How can we just try to get them some competence in using this digital product? The third point in case of or context of Google is transparency. Just transparency of this business model, and of course data protection. It's the most important thing we discussed in Germany today. So some people in Germany yesterday, some political persons said we have to talk about Facebook as a criminal aspect. It's criminal Facebook stuff, and so on and so on. So that's a new topic, of course, but if you talk about Google, you have to talk about this.
Okay.
now we can open the debate if we have 10 minutes to discussion, if there are someone that want to do a question. All table members. Oh, no? Okay, please.
Don't you think that the main problem of people not wanting, like writers and journalists, not wanting their pieces in the internet on Google, for example, is the intellectual value that they give to the books? I think not in a good way. Just it's that I think that is the problem. The intellectual value that they give to their books doesn't give them the power to put them on the internet, because they think that they lose power. The book loses power because of being put in the internet.
Someone wants to.
Autores, livros ou jornais ou revistas, você deve influenciar e se tornam produtos mais vulgares.
Well, I'd say that's a very, very interesting question. If you look from the political side, that means, are governments and politicians interested that an increasing number of citizens have the capacity or the ability to discuss, to have the knowledge to discuss things that in principle should be only discussed by an elite or something like that? Well, my answer is again, and I'm sorry if I say so, the football and gambling. We live in a society where gambling is an evil thing. But China is a society where gambling is a family thing. Exactly the same thing. Exactly the same activity. It's a cultural point of view. So, gambling is nowadays in Europe seen as a problem. But the newspapers in the United Kingdom, most of their resources are coming nowadays from fantasy games. Fantasy games are the development of football games using networks where the plays and the moves doesn't exist, but the players are real. And the bets on the next play, those who have higher bets, is the one that wins. So, who is losing power here? Again, it's the traditional gambling system, the lotteries and the casinos, that you don't need to go more for a room to gamble, or you don't need to buy a lottery ticket that just comes out once. You can gamble when you want, at any time, at any hour. Who is losing here the power of the business? So, the question again for me, the answer is the regulation. Because if you use, for what you said, if it's true that writers and publishers of books, they don't want to lose their power. The problem is that until now, they could choose how many authors they would publish every year. But from now on, they cannot choose that, because authors can make self-publishing. Authors can go to the nets and say to the same people, look, I'm here, I've written this book or this poem, or I have these ideas, and I want to share. Just share it. So, on my view, and to answer to you, I don't think, I think that maybe some could seem like that, but that is not the trend.
It's an interesting model in Moscow, because there is an offer, they offer ebook readers with 50 of the most important books in the Russian history, without any cost. can see in the metro that that a lot of people read with ebook readers because it's interesting for them. It's very high intellectual literature. Tolstoy and all. And maybe that's a interesting option to combine this intellectual aspect and this new technical aspect. Maybe I think it's very interesting because I saw that and I asked them. It's an interesting aspect.
Someone want to add any commentary? No? One question. Last question. Okay.
What's your opinion about cell phones as a device to produce and receive and distribute audiovisual contents and the internet impact of this kind of technological change?
Excuse me, can you say that again? Like,
Los teléfonos móviles como equipos de producción, distribución de contenidos audiovisuales.
okay, like.
And
So,
do you have some relevant experience about it?
I don't get very well the question. Do you get it? Do you understand the question, guys?
Well, I would say, what's the role of cell phones in the production and in the distribution of contents? Do you think, or I understood that non-professional contents will
Also
compete with the contents that are professionally distributed?
Do you mean citizen report, for example?
Yeah, for example, or even the enterprise distribution and production focused to consume by cell phone.
Okay.
I think it's one point where you can see that is in the production of news. If you think about user-generated content, if something happens all over the world, I think only 20, 40, 60 seconds, and you can find first pictures or videos on the internet. That's really crazy. I remember the time was a little bit younger than CNN was. My professors, my study said CNN is most important. If anything happened in the world, first on air is CNN. And today it's not CNN, it's the user-generated content, I think. And that's the changing aspect. And maybe it's a commercial aspect, I don't know. And so if you just have a very, very interesting sport, it must not be very high in quality. Interesting is the use of the picture at all. I remember the first pictures from this attack at the tube in Moscow. It was 1 minute and 25 seconds. We saw the first pictures from the airport. So that's one thing.
Yeah, and that's about pictures, but video, for example, we could be broadcasting right now, like broadcasting live the whole thing.
Without asking me.
Well, I would ask you.
What does it mean?
So that, that's the power of mobile. So people can be watching all over the planet what you are capturing live with the cell phone. So definitely has so much power, and with the technology and the quality that it has now, the phone, you can even shoot a movie like in HD, and you look at the movie and you are like, you would never think that it's done with a phone. I saw movies that they are like, wow, and you see the making of and was a phone on a tripod. So you see the phone, and that's the camera. So it's the best time in the technology and in the history of technology, and to create things using the technology that you have. So for you guys, you are in the best time ever in the history to be alive. So congratulations.
Second example is YouTube, of course.
But you're talking specifically about the cell phone. And if we think about this from a relationship to the technology development, and kind of like from the perspective of engineering, Moore's law, then the potential for increasingly high quality in the production capacity looks good, because the toolkit continues to become more and more refined and more powerful. but there are two major questions about whether or not this is really going to have as much or the degree to which it can have as much impact as the discussion of potential would suggest. And one impact is the concerns about more and more of social life being captured and recorded without your permission, and therefore questions about invasion of privacy and how much should be in the public domain and where the lines are. And the second major issue is whether or not it is affordable to roam and to use the mobile device in the way that it's actually, that it would enable us to use. But in fact, right now, the way the telecommunication infrastructure works economically, it's not really cost effective to use your mobile phone for these much more heavy use of data transmission, downloading, and distribution at the present time. It's okay if you're within your own domestic arena where you don't have to pay extra for the data transmission, but it's not viable around the world. And there's one final issue, which is that I heard a very interesting presentation by Robert G. Picard from Oxford, the Reuters Center recently. He's been working on some statistics that looks at the penetration of a variety of different media, and particularly looking at cell phones and so forth. And of course, there are pockets of the world where there's an incredibly high penetration, like South Korea. Part of the reason that example works in South Korea is a unique case. But then there's large parts of the world where there's a real absence of infrastructure. And it's very primitive, what people have access to and so forth. So those are at least some issues that come into play there that maybe limit what would be otherwise the more utopian view.
Thank you.
Just
Do we have a question?
Just, João, let me
The last
add
question.
just one thing is that question is the only area where I do believe that there is a large and huge separation between those who see mobiles as an entertainment piece and those who see mobiles as a communication piece. And this is the native generation of those who were born already in the digital world and so on. This is one of the few areas where I do believe that, for me, I cannot see a cell phone in any other way if it is not a communication system. But for my grandsons, for them, it's just an entertainment device. So it's totally different. And my answer to your question will go this way.
I would like to ask about, I was thinking, we talk about the digitalization of the books, contents, possibility of doing this, and this is by the public libraries. It should be possible to go to the library, any book that you can bring to the internet, but because we are absolutely, and we are just disclosing this option to the population, and so we are closing the cloud part. And also, because we were talking also about the availability of some content, of which are public contents and not others. So when we can make money with our free content for the other 9 things we produce, just to see which one works. And I mean, there are some contents that hasn't to be hasn't produced. Usually we have to that by all sources of benefit. We are trying to make benefits for something that is not maybe we are not in collections. We are producing something that it hasn't been paid. It's paid it's not wrong. So
Well, I mean, of course, the economists would talk about this from the standpoint of so-called positive externalities. What is the benefits of having contents widely available and at the lowest possible price so that they could be generally consumed, but I don't really like the term consumed in this case, so that they could be, accessed and could become beneficial. I think that one of I can't answer it all, we're kind of out of time, but I could just say one thing about this. there are two ways in which something can be valuable. Something can be valuable because it's scarce. It's not generally available, it's rare. So we talk about gold, we talk about diamonds, we talk about a lot of particular arts, of a work of art. There's only so many from this artist. His whole opus is there, that's it. It's limited. He's dead now, there's not going to be another one. It's rare. But the other way, and it's much more common in media, is what Mike was referring to with network effects. The cell phone's worthless if I'm the only one with it. But if everybody I know has one, it's very valuable. It's a network effect. And I think it's the same way with content of this kind we're talking about. The more widely used and available it is, the more potentially valuable it becomes. I don't want my work behind a wall. I rather resent these journals that tell me, oh, we can make your article available for anybody and you would have to pay $3,000. Why should I pay you $3,000 for my article that you published? It should be free. And I want it free because that means you can cite me. Because you can read me, you don't have to go buy the article. Right? So my work has more value because it's not scarce. And that's something unique about media content. Now, it's not unique about all media content. Part of the reason why the Wall Street Journal is able to use a firewall effectively is because people in the trading industry, in equities, need access to that information in order for them to be successful in their industry. So they pay for access to that data behind the firewall at the Wall Street Journal. Yeah.
So, thank you very much for the great debate. So now we have a last speaker, guest speaker, Greg. So thank you very much for the participation. And Greg, this is your time.
What did you have, Mike? What did you read? What did you
I check mine. One moment. Yeah. Great. Sorry.
Okay.
Always
I appreciate your patience. I mean, you kind of hung in here the whole day, and you're probably tired, and you would just as soon go home. But I hope that the last presentation was at least the best one. That would be ideal for me. Then everybody can say, "Wow, I'm so glad I stayed with you. That guy was good." I don't know. Let's do that. This presentation is based on a book that I've waved around a couple of times, so I'm not going to do that too much more. But I brought this copy for my friend Paolo, who invited me kindly to come today and present. And the book is called Small Among Giants, Television Broadcasting in Smaller Countries. And I was one of the editors. The other editor is Christian Nissen, who's he's a former Director General of DR in Denmark. And we edited this book, which is a collection of empirical evidence that essentially interrogates this question of whether or not it is true that big countries, big markets, large populations, and oftentimes great wealth, whether or not they really are good models for small countries, those who have less money, those who have perhaps smaller populations. And this is a very, very relevant question because when you look at what happens inside the European Commission, and when you look at what happens inside many media companies in small countries, they look to these big ones, these big countries, these big markets, as though these are as though these are good models. Now, the essential argument that I want to make today is not only from the book; it's also from other things that I've been doing here in the last several years. Is that arguments? We're going to really focus on public broadcasting in this presentation because I was asked to do so by Paolo. So we're looking at the public service sector in media. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that discussions about financing are not just about money. Discussions about financing are about many things that have great importance for the future of media systems and the role that media are going to play in a variety of societies. So, let me start. In Europe and elsewhere, there is a long, and I would say frequently fruitful tradition of looking to countries that have large markets and have comparatively great wealth as though these countries would be suitable models for building or for developing media systems more or less everywhere. And most often the preferred models that are pointed to are Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And this preference, this desire to look to these big countries with their big systems and their great wealth as models, this is absolutely evident when we look at what governments and regulators are doing as they design policies that are related to industry structure, and particularly as relates to the public service broadcasting sector. But it is equally evident when we look at what executive managers in many of these countries and these broadcasting companies are doing when they're looking for fresh possibilities. They tend to look also at the big companies and the big countries and say, why don't we do that here in our country? And the problem is that, as with many traditions, this often passes without any critique. It's kind of taken for granted. It's assumed, simply assumed, that big countries with big markets and big operators are suitable models. And that, in fact, it should be desirable to copy those. Small Among Giants, this book, questions that assumption and tries to answer a range of relevant questions on the basis of empirical data. Can anyone realistically expect a media market in a country with a few million people to have the same opportunities as countries with 2 or 3 or 400 million people? How reasonable is it to assume that a country with a gross domestic product of $15 trillion, that's the United States, that it would have exactly the same possibilities for any small country with many times less than that in its gross domestic product, or even that a small country would have all the same needs? Is it rational that we would expect a public broadcaster in a small country with only a fraction of the revenue and the workforce of the BBC, or ZDF in Germany, or America's major networks to be able to copy their way of doing things? I would suggest that when the conditions are different, so are the solutions. So an international group of media researchers were involved in research that addresses this assumption that one size fits all. And what this book basically proposes as a core assumption, or a principle really, is that size is of fundamental importance for understanding how broadcasting works and why. And the research confirms the importance of size both in terms of population and in terms of economy. Both the size of a country's population and the size of its economy affect the conditions and the possibilities for TV markets. We should expect that a small country like Luxembourg, which is wealthy, would have a whole lot more going on than a small country like Moldavia, which is poor. We should expect that a big rich country like Germany would have a lot more happening than a small rich country like Finland. And that a big poor country like Romania would have many more possibilities than a small poor country like Latvia. You begin to see this is quite complex when you begin to interrogate the relationship between wealth, population size, and what the country can do, any country can do with its media system. And it gets even more complex when we have to then also consider the political and cultural factors that characterize what a media system is, both socially and historically. And this is especially evident, for example, when we compare how broadcasting is done in Western Europe with Eastern Europe, and how it's done in Northern Europe compared with Southern Europe. Tasks that various authors in this book have taken up. Now for this presentation, as I said, I'm going to just focus on the funding of public service broadcasting. There's a lot of other elements covered in this book for those who are interested, although it is only about TV, it's not about the internet and about radio. We took that decision deliberately because television is the most influential of broadcast media, and that's what we really wanted to look at in this. The substance of this presentation, by the way, is not all my own work. I have a colleague that I work with named Christian Edelbold Barry, who is a PhD candidate at the Copenhagen School of Business and is currently doing his dissertation on this topic. And as you may note here on the slide, he's also contributed his own chapter in addition to some work that he did in co-authoring with myself. Now today, public service broadcasters are involved in a lot more than radio and television. In many countries, these PSB companies have taken a pioneering role in developing what we now call non-linear channels. And in very many cases, the services and the content that are offered through the internet are being widely used. In recent years, it has therefore become increasingly common to refer to this sector as public service media. And that transition from broadcaster to something more than broadcaster, not neglecting that they still do radio and TV, but that they also do so much more. That transition is extremely complex and has many dimensions, such as financial management, new organizational structures, the training of new employee skills, the development of public-private partnership agreements, and of course, a very rapidly growing competition. Now, for the past 20 years at least, nearer to 30, since the mid-'80s, public service broadcasting has engaged in direct competition with the commercial sector in broadcasting, and it has had to deal with a great many challenges that sector has posed, not only in competition, but also in the political market, through their lobbies and through lawsuits, that is to say, litigation. What's relatively new and quite significant today is the growing conflict also with newspaper publishing. And that's precisely because they are no longer only in television and radio. When these companies become part of the online environment, they suddenly go head-to-head with their newspaper rivals. And that has become a prickly problem because these publishers have the domestic muscle to cause a great many difficulties. Now, the public service ideal, the ideal of doing public service broadcasting, is that one sector of a media system should primarily serve the interests of civil society. And for that reason, the idea is that this sector, at least, needs to be at arm's length, as we say, from both commercial influences and political manipulation. And of course, in practice, this is always a matter of degrees. It's never been absolute. Since the introduction of commercial broadcasting, competition has in fact increasingly dominated the logic of management in the public sector. And competition has become incredibly complicated today. It is not only over audience, it is also over political support, financial resources, talented content makers, and the rights to program. This loss of revenue created complications and chronic deficits that have required round after round of cost savings at YLE since 2005. Now, I'm not saying that YLE should not make cuts. There clearly was some inefficiency. That's evident in the fact that since the time that this all started, they have added new television and radio channels and have been able to program all of them with less people at lower costs. But there was clearly a problem in that YLE's economic future is now unstable. This has prompted calls for updating the license fee system to account for the growth of the Internet. And the proposal has been to switch from the TV license fee to a media license fee. That was the recommendation of another committee in 2009. The new fee was to be charged to every household, whether they owned a TV or not. And in the proposal, a fee would also have been paid by every business who had an annual turnover of at least 400,000 euros, about 525 euros in total. As a result, the cost per household would have dropped by 22%. And the net result of this would have produced about 450 million euros in 2010. So none of this seems to be particularly alarming or any real burden, except, as one might expect, for those businesses who were quite unhappy to foot any part of this bill whatsoever, even though for them it was really small change. The entire proposal collapsed as the newspaper industry in Finland launched an aggressive campaign against YLE. This was usefully analyzed by Dr. Marco Alafosi and Professor Taisto Huinen at my own university in Tampere. The situation really got out of hand when two of the bosses tangled themselves in a personal feud that became the face of this dispute. This would be the former Director General Mikael Jungner of YLE, who more or less was sacked as a result, and the former chairman of the Finnish Newspaper Association, Mikael Pentikainen. Political figures then joined the fray, with the Minister of Communications, Ms. Suvi Linden, tabling the entire proposal. It's supposed to be taken up and decided again by the new government that was elected last May, but we don't know what the outcome is going to be. Alafosi and Huinen think the reason for this outcome is not entirely political. Rather, it should be understood more as the growing relations between politics and commerce in media industries today. From a strictly standpoint, the two sectors, meaning newspapers and public broadcasting, have now become direct rivals to each other in ways they never were earlier. And they are increasingly looking to expand their own operations at the expense of the other. These challenges are clearly caused by digitization and convergence. As the old saying goes, in English at least, whoever pays the piper gets to call the tune. Although one must be careful how far we want to go with this, I will conclude with some discussion about implications of how the mode of funding impacts what a media company prioritizes. There is, in fact, plenty of evidence that companies funded by advertising are very often influenced by the companies who do the advertising. In a story reported by Advertising Age, the trade magazine of record for the American advertising industry, the oil company British Petroleum issued a directive in 2005 that demanded their advertisements be taken away from, quote, any publication or any edition of a publication that includes potentially objectionable content, unquote. Even potentially objectionable is enough to have it pulled. Objectionable was defined as anything contrary to the company's marketing and branding interests. As the same report concluded, there are many other cases exactly like this. It is very common as a demand today. Moreover, as the report also discussed, increasingly today advertisers are sponsoring special sections in newspapers that look like news and have some newsworthy aspects, but are very carefully written and positioned so they can place their own ads in a highly desirable context. Newspapers that are in trouble on a financial basis find this a very attractive proposition. And finally, we should also understand that advertisers are only rarely interested in every consumer. They are interested in target markets. There is no economic benefit for a media company that depends on advertising to produce content that appeals to people who don't have the money to buy their products or an interest in their product. So advertising has impact on content in many ways, sometimes direct
and very often indirect. And this is a key reason why the license fee system is preferable. It is especially effective for keeping the media firm at arm's length from market forces. Of course, we should also observe that it is not easy to end advertising in public broadcasting after it has been included for some period of time. Path dependency is also an important principle. The evidence for that is clear in France, where President Sarkozy has been trying to end advertising in French public service broadcasting. This was something the commercial media sector in France has said for years they wanted to happen, but as soon as they began to really do it, there was widespread resistance. State subsidy, usually in the form of direct appropriation from the budget, also has implications. In many cases, this approach encourages, or at least it facilitates, political involvement in the kinds of content that are being made and distributed. That has been especially evident in Russia and in some states in Eastern Europe, where governments fund so-called public media but take a very direct role in affecting the content. But influence does not need to be so direct to cause problems. The license fee was abolished in the Netherlands in January 2000. Financing came directly from the budget. As the EBU report from 2009 observed, this was described at the time as a merely technical matter of no great concern to anyone. But the practical result was a cut of 19% between 2005 and 2006. Some of that was restored in 2007, but it has since been slashed due to austerity measures related to the recession. There is lower stability for NOS and growing concerns about its vulnerability. None of this is to say that the Dutch government is involved in manipulating content in Dutch public broadcasting. They're not. It's to say that the impact of budgetary decisions has effects on content. Subscription funding also has direct and indirect effects. This approach can be organized according to a donation model, as they do in the United States. That's probably the only realistic alternative to the license fee if the point is to maintain arm's length distance from the state and the market. But the problem with the subscription option is that it is not stable. Downturns in the wider economic economy impact donations, both in the number of people who are donating and the amount of money they are willing to donate. Also, a lot of time, expense, and effort is necessary to keep the donations coming. And finally, it's also clearly the case that the kinds of content produced and distributed depend on the preferences of those who make the donations, not on the general public. The same complications are evident for the direct subscription media, as in magazines and pay-per-view TV. But another complication that arises there is the availability of content and services depends directly on one's ability to pay. This approach is not based on universal service. It's based on tiers of service. The more the payer pays, the better the piper plays. Obviously, this is not encouraging for a public service orientation. The license fee system is in fact the surest method for guaranteeing four objectives. 1, protecting funding from political influence and manipulation. 2, increasing financial certainty in order to support planning and risk-taking in content development. 3, providing predictability to moderate market-based pressures. And 4, establishing a sustainable level of funding. The threat to PSB funding has multiple dimensions, and they should be taken seriously. Pressures to reduce PSB funding, to change the funding mechanism, to make some portion of license fee revenue contestable for commercial companies, all of this is growing. Moreover, the economic difficulties and mounting deficits caused by this recession and its aftermath account for decreasing political and popular support. And finally, one should also take into account the pressure for ex-ante, so-called ex-ante approaches for approving new services, which slow things down and make it difficult to plan development. I would like to end with 5 arguments that are pertinent to all the complaints against public broadcasting. 1, the right to operate in and to profit from the broadcasting market does not naturally belong to the private commercial interests. It is always and invariably a matter for states to determine. It is not predetermined, nor is it primarily only a matter of economic interests. 2, public broadcasting companies that receive public money have a responsibility to cater not only to mainstream audiences and those that are commercially viable and valuable as properties, but to marginal and minority audiences that are not commercially important. 3, public funding encourages public broadcasting companies to provide content that can be legitimated outside of commercial imperatives. This argues the importance of funding or providing for sufficient capacity to make investments in quality productions and to take risks. 4, PSB should not be mainly about competing for revenue. It should be mainly about anchoring an industry and providing standards for benchmarking. PSB should provide a positive structural influence on the whole system, and therefore, for that reason, should be allowed, not only allowed, but actually encouraged to develop public service dimensions in nonlinear media. And finally, 5th, PSB does not inherently have a right to any public treasure. It must earn its way every day and in every way. Public broadcasting is only legitimate to the extent that the content and services it provides are distinctive in the market, that is to say, not like commercial properties, and that its content is relevant for audiences. The future of public broadcasting is not a matter primarily of economics. It is a matter of principle and a matter of principles. As we argue in a forthcoming book I'm editing now that will come out in January, a book titled Regaining the Initiative for Public Service Media, attacks on PSB have been fueled by concerns that are in fact often legitimate. Public broadcasting companies have been correctly criticized in many countries for sacrificing distinctiveness in the pursuit of competitive success. Without evidence of strategic development that is clearly focused on renewing and revitalizing the core values that legitimate the enterprise, public broadcasting simply cannot make a convincing argument to validate continuing support. Convictions are based on principles. Indeed, they are derived from principles. The public service sector and media today seems too often adrift conceptually and astray operationally. And this certainly implies that for this sector to regain the initiative and beyond that to maintain the initiative, its executive managers need to take a leadership role in the work that is necessary to construct a compelling vision of what public service and media means for the 21st century. The real problem is not about money. The real problem is a crisis of legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rex. Your presentation is very opportune for us because we are discussing the role of Portuguese RTP, Portuguese Public Service. So we have 10 minutes to discussion. If you have any questions, please.
Hi. Hi.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation.
Very well. Thank you. Thank you.
I do have a question which is very particular and which goes back into what we have been discussing in Portugal about the ways to subsidize our public service broadcast. And it has to do with how they spend the money.
Yeah.
Because in Portugal until now, and apparently it's going to change in the short term, but until now, the public service is subsidized.
Yeah.
So we all pay a monthly amount, which you have mentioned we don't have a clue, but it's there. It's in the monthly invoice with the electricity bill, and each house pays it, either we have a TV set or not.
Yeah.
And apart from that, and it's another point I wanted to make, state indirectly subsidized our broadcaster, public broadcaster, because it endorses the financing, the debt financing the broadcaster has. So it's another way of not appearing in the accounts and subsidizing even further the broadcaster. But the thing is, it also receives money from advertising.
Right.
So, because of that, they want to raise audiences. And because of that, usually and recurrently, they bid on the transmission rights over football and other sports, but in football.
Sure.
So, do you think that that kind of sports, the transmission rights of sports events, is public service?
Okay, good question. And this question really has to do with where are, in a way, limitations in genre, and what are the kind of priorities for these companies as they think about their future. Now, it's not only because of advertising that they're into this. Even companies like YLE, which has no advertising, is really keen about, for example, world hockey events. Because these are very important to the Finnish public, viewing public, and their thinking is that, you know, we need to have certain kinds of content that attract a mass audience and that prove our importance for the society. Now, when you ask that question, do I think that's legitimate? That's a really difficult one to answer, but I'll just give you my own personal opinion on this. In the early 2000s, there was a remarkable group of people who were managers of these big companies. Arne Vestberg at YLE, particularly in Northern Europe, and Christian Nielsen at DR and so forth. And these guys were arguing, and they argued successfully for the idea that public broadcasting needs to become public service media, and it needs to be full-scale media, meaning that they should not be forbidden to be in anything. They should have the possibility to be in everything. I understand the political reason they made that argument, and they basically won that argument, and they've had permission to kind of do pretty much whatever seemed to be in their best, in a way, business interests. But in my view, there's a lot of content that public broadcasting companies are involved with that aren't public service. For example, I said this over lunch to someone, I can't really legitimate the idea that YLE has a rock and roll radio channel. I mean, there's all kinds of rock and roll radio channels in Finland. Why do you need a public broadcasting rock and roll radio channel? It may be true that you could have, I think you would have, a legitimate idea to have a radio program about rock and roll and deals with new talent that's in the Finnish society that's not yet been discovered, or deals with the history of Finnish rock music and popular culture. Yeah, sure. But a rock and roll, flow radio, format, structure kind of thing, why? There's no scarcity of this. Now, when it comes to sports, that's a little more difficult. And it's more difficult because very often what happens in Finland, at least, with the sports packages is they go behind the paywall. So the commercial guys take them, they outbid, and they own it, but then they don't just open it up to you. You got to pay a certain monthly fee in order to access that content on a special channel, subscription type channel. That's one problem. And the second problem has to do with things like, I'll use another example of the Olympics. The Olympics are absolutely horrible for a public broadcasting company. They're a nightmare expense. They cost an enormous amount of money, and in order to cover them, you've got to have a lot of channel capacity, because there's events going on all the time. Well, in places like the United States, they just don't cover them all. What they cover are events where Americans are competing. Any event that doesn't have an American competing is not covered. And what they cover is only, like, for example, the last part of the competition, not all the stuff up to it. All right? So out of an hour of Olympics coverage in the United States, what you will see is about 20 minutes of competition, 20 minutes of commercials, and 20 minutes of let's meet the athletes in their normal lives. My brother-in-law, who's a Finn, lives in America, has lived there since he was 16 years old. He's 64 today. He comes to Finland every 2 years to watch the Olympics on YLE. Because he said that's the only place he really sees the Olympics. So that one's a little more tricky for me to answer. But I would have to say that the bottom line, in my view, is that what the executive management of these companies have to do, and it will be a different answer in each society, and that is legitimate if we think that the way that the mandate goes is a domestic matter, not an international one. It should be individual to the country. But they have to now focus on what exactly is public service broadcasting and media today in this society. What is legitimate? What case do we make that people support? What case do we make that our competitors support? What case do we make that really resonates with non-commercial or non-governmental organizations in the larger civil society? They have to be able to make a case. Robert's arguing this in the new book. It's really a great chapter. that they just haven't been able to do this. And part of what they will have to do that Robert doesn't argue, but I do, is they have to decide what they're not going to do anymore. Because they just don't have the money. There's not enough money to do it all. And it's not fair to keep going back to the public and asking for more and more money. Not when you're in a situation where unemployment's up, health care's uncertain, education's going through the roof, people are having problems just feeding their kids. It's difficult to go back and say, oh, we need another 100 euros out of your budget for our public broadcasting pot. I don't know. That's a hard one. If you're going to get that money, you're going to have to make a case that those people say, yeah, that's true. It's worth it. And if you can't make that case, then it's not. And you won't be, in my case, in my mind, you will not be legitimate if you can only make that case to government. Public broadcasting companies are pretty good at dealing with government parties and making a case for them, but they're not very good at making a case for the people who's actually paying the bill. That's my complaint.
Thank you. One more question.
How relevant do you think will be in regards to the analog switch off in the next year?
Well, analog switch off has already happened in a lot of places in Europe. It happened in Finland in August 2007, and it has gone quite well. There were some initial problems, but I mean, you know, it got worked out pretty well. The biggest advantage to the switchover is the fact that digital channels cost less in terms of just the general, the energy costs and things that are involved with transmission in an analog world cost more than in a digital world. And digital is much more spectrum efficient, so you can have more channels. You can have a multiplex more easily. The disadvantages and the complications to it is what it costs the average everyday consumer in order to get a digital set or to have set-top boxes. And different governments have chosen to go about this in different ways. In Finland, it was generally a consumer issue, but for people who were old, living in nursing homes and on below a certain amount of income, government subsidized them to get set-top boxes, not new TV sets, but set-top boxes that allow them to watch digital on analog. So it's difficult to answer that question. It's going on, it's been going on already now for the last, what, 5 years, 6 years? I don't see any choice in the matter. What's the more interesting question in a way, not to say your question is not relevant, but to me what's really interesting is that digital radio has been a complete failure. Almost everywhere. The only place where it's had any real traction is Britain. You know, they have been able to sell DAB there, but it's not really there's a lot of concern about it even there. And that's the interesting thing. Does it mean that radio, there's not enough value in the digital world for a radio upgrade to justify and legitimate the cost increases? I don't know. That's an interesting question.
There are more questions? Someone want to do a question? No?
It's just related to that. But did you find new features deriving from the use of digital from this switch off? Because apparently what we have in countries where you have the digital switch off is that the product it's the same.
Yeah, it's more or less the same. And the problem with it was, okay, there's two things with this. One problem is that the cost of now, the upgrades in television technology are becoming really it's not only the switch to digital, now it's the switch from digital to HD. And now it will be not only the switch to HD, but 3D HD at some point. And these cumulative costs just continue to create more and more complications and difficulties. Right? I mean, you got to produce content, but that means your whole infrastructure inside your company in the production side has to be completely compatible with whatever it is you're going to broadcast. So most of them have not had HD content or whatever to take full advantage of it. So that's one problem. But the second problem has been that it's really, I mean, there's all kinds of potential technology offers, but my own personal experience and views of people is that most people are a lot more conservative than you think. When most people sit down to watch TV, they don't want to sit there like it's a computer. They seem to kind of want to turn it on and have a beer or a glass of wine and just lean back. And I'm not really sure how much interaction people want to have with TV all the time. So this has been an issue. What has worked quite well and been really important is the electronic program guide. That aspect of digital has been quite good because it helps people to do their own recording and everything. You know, they're planning ahead and kind of sets the system up, and then they don't have to worry about it. You know, set it and forget it. It records everything, and then you got your own TV, my TV, our TV, whatever it is, later.
Okay.
One question, license fee and political influence. In Germany, most of the important positions in the public broadcasting are political decisions.
Yeah.
What is your opinion?
Well, you've had a movement. There was a period, roughly mid-90s through the early 2000s, where there was this move towards professional managerialism that was trying to create managerial executive staff inside public broadcasting companies that were not nominated so much directly or by the political parties or quite so tightly connected. But that was never really successful. And where it did get a good start, economic turmoil and problems, it kind of ended it, because there's always been this kind of revolving door and good brother society behind closed doors between political parties, certain political parties, and the public broadcasting companies. And they have this long heritage. And one of the real problems that we have, absolutely, with this sector, is that their institutional heritage creates such a strict and rigid path that it's just almost impossible to change that path, it seems. And as I said in another article that I wrote at the beginning of the 2009 Wright book, there's two ways to understand institution. You can understand an institution as an organization, like YLE or ZDF, and you can understand institution as an orientation, like marriage is an institution. And the problem with these companies is they're supposed to be an institution in their orientation, public service. But the reality of it is often that they're an institution in the organizational sense, and what they mainly try to support is their own self-interest. Now, in a way, you can understand that because, you know, it's their job, their retirement, all these things that are involved here. But in another way, this is the reason why they end up always being open for this kind of public ridicule and suspicion. And a major part of this is just too much involvement between government and the leadership of these companies. Not necessarily the content, but the leadership, the management level of this.
Thank you very much. So, that was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.